thanks everybody for coming. I'm Dan Runde. I'm president of SID-Washington. We have a very interesting panel. We're going to be discussing the role of the Coalition for International Development Companies, CIDC. I think there's, but before we get into that, I just want to thank our friends at Chemonics for hosting this and having the space. I know we have any number of different events coming up. The annual conference for SID-Washington is June the 6th, June the 5th. June the 5th, it's going to be at the Washington Convention Center this year. So mark your calendars. I think it'll be a very interesting discussion this year. So just keep that on your radar screen. And we'll have a chapter event next month on the Arab winter, as it's being described sometime in February. I guess something upbeat and positive. So, but so keep keep an eye on the SIDW website for information about the scheduling of that, which we hope will be done by on Monday. So there will be a chapter event next month on that, and then June the 5th. And so, as you know, we have any number of different events, and so just keep an eye on our website. I think you all have biographies of the speakers in front of you, so I don't think it's necessary to go through biographies of each of the speakers. I think what I'd like to do is just make some framing remarks, and then I'm going to turn the floor over to each of the speakers. Some will be speaking from a podium, others will be standing. I think there's a lot of curiosity about what CIDC is. Some trepidation, some curiosity. I also think enthusiasm and interest. It's sparked a spectrum of emotions when I've talked to a variety of people. I'm very enthusiastic personally that CIDC has been started, and I think that it's important that we understand that the development is done in the United States through an ecosystem of partners, and that we moved away from a model of budget support in the early 1980s or the late 1970s, and that having an ecosystem provides flexibility and the ability to bring a variety of perspectives and solutions to problems, as well as leveraging a variety of different kinds of assets and expertise. And I think, for the most part, there are a lot of positive things about the model that we use to deliver development to support development, if you will. But at the same time, I think that there's been, sometimes a lack of understanding about all the different actors that are partners or supporters of development, and I think that's been one of the reasons for CIDC to come about. So I think I'll stop there, and I'm going to just introduce briefly each of the panelists, and then I'm going to turn the floor over to Betsy to start. So we have Betsy Bassan, former SID-Washington president and the CEO of the Panagora Group. Panagora Group. We also have Asif Shaikh, who is the president of IRG, also a former SID-Washington president, and has an affiliation with CSIS as well. And then we also have Paul O'Brien, who's with Oxfam, who's been kind enough to come and provide a civil society perspective, and is also a SID-Washington board member. So it's all in the family, but also I think what reflects the beauty of SID, which is it's the International Development Town Square, and it's a place where we can have a conversation bringing together a variety of voices and perspectives on a particular topic. So, Betsy, I'm going to turn the floor over to you.
Okay, excellent. Thank you, Dan. Pleasure to be here today. I like a podium, and I'm going to just move it over a little bit because I feel like I'm way here on the left. And all of you guys seem way there on the right. I'm sure it's not your politics, right? But if you want anybody move more towards the center, you are welcome to do that. So, you know, it's really fun to be here today with one of my favorite groups, SID, and also to talk about one of my newest favorite kids, the new kid on the block, CIDC, the Coalition of International Development Companies. I'm going to share a little bit about why we formed, how we came into being, what we do, and also take a minute to address some myths and assumptions. A little on the history. Why did we form? We were hearing a lot of commentary about companies. We realized that we needed to create a better understanding about us, about the work we do, and really be a part of the discussion at the table in real time. We realized it was easy to lump us in with companies that, while in federal contracting, are not at all like us, the big IT companies, defense companies, security companies. The chatter was not so new as much as it was increasingly loud and increasingly influencing policy in a way that we felt was not beneficial to the future of development. In short, we recognized we have a really important role that we're playing in delivering accountable and transparent results that serve U.S. foreign assistance goals, and that it was increasingly important for us to bring that experience and knowledge forward so that it could be included in decision making. In fact, we began to see that by not having our voice brought forward, we were acting irresponsibly and not living up to the leadership role that our community actually provides. For example, and you heard just from what Dan was saying, 3 of CIDC's leadership have been a past president of SID. Chirito, Asif, myself. How could we provide so much industry leadership but not respond to this current need? It's important to note that the companies, the development companies, actually represent a huge percentage of the development implementation force, at least 40%, and that's just for US aid. Without our voice at the table, that means that there's a huge amount of evidence and experience missing in the discussions on development. However, we're not really like the NGO community, where interfacing is just a part of the DNA. No, we're sort of nose to the grindstone, get the work done, continue to serve. I have been personally privileged to have worked with NGOs, the private sector, and USAID. And in fact, I spent about 10 years in the NGO community. When I first joined the private sector, already about a third into my career, I know you must think I started at age 10, there you go. I was really struck by the different approaches to communication. And I remember commenting on this to my mentor, Tony Teal, because it never felt right to me, especially as I came to appreciate the depth of this community's contribution to development, carrying out vast projects that reach scale, cover huge geographic areas, and grapple with the major issues, things that would be considered here at home in the US major domestic social and economic initiatives. Looking back, that feeling probably fueled my passion for SID and USGLC, helping to bring the voice of the development companies, our business savvy, innovation, American values, our entrepreneurialism, to the development dialogue. One could say that CIDC represents a maturation of our community, that we have reached a point of such pride and confidence in our work that we want to take it public, we want to share it, we want to be a part of the development conversation, and make sure all evidence is brought to bear in the policy and aid reform process. Thus, really, it's a dream for me, personally, to have CIDC form, and a perfect match to use the SID platform as the venue for telling you all about the newest kid on the block. At some point during Asif's and my great collaboration in SID, he as president and me as VP for programs, SID became the global town square of development. So it's especially fitting that we hold this session here today, bringing SID and the community we represent fully into the development town square. So how did we come into being? There was a growing sense in our community that we needed a new presence. The PSC, the Professional Services Council, which is our trade association, just like Interaction is the trade association for NGOs, has an International Development Task Force, IDTF, primarily focused on nuts and bolts federal contracting issues. While doing a great job in that area, we also needed a presence that brought together our knowledge and development to interface at the level of policy and strategy. So in December of 2010, Richard Dryman, Chemonics' president, called a meeting with 9 companies representing all the various sizes and sectors, which I had the privilege of facilitating. When I launched Panagora in January, yes, now celebrating 1 year, woohoo, in business, it became the 10th company of that group. To give credit where credit is due, let me list the CIDC founding companies and recognize them for their leadership. In alphabetical order: Apt Associates, Chemonics, Creative Associates, DAI, DTS, Integra, IRG, the Kaizen Company, MSI, and ultimately Panagora Group. And you can hear in that list the range of sizes from large, medium, and small. We decided to move forward. We met again at DAI. We initiated a concept paper undertaken in a participatory process, first the initial 10 companies and ultimately the entire community of development companies. We quickly formed an advisory committee that continues to exist, and we moved forward to frame out the mission, audiences, message, objectives, governance, and finance. What is our mission? Our mission is to inform and educate audiences on the critical role of international development companies in delivering accountable and transparent results in support of U.S. national security, economic, and humanitarian goals. Who do we want to reach? What are our audiences? The administration, Congress, associations and NGOs, media, and think tanks, probably represented by many of you in this room today. What are our messages? We want to let people know that we are proud to be servants of the U.S. government, helping to meet its foreign assistance and international development goals by delivering cost-effective services and results that they define. We're committed to open and transparent competition, which we believe brings the best value to the taxpayer and the most effective way to attain development goals. We want to let people know that our staff are dedicated development professionals and technical specialists with decades of experience living and working in developing countries. Many are former Peace Corps volunteers, many come from NGOs, developing countries, and the donor community. We want to bring forward our experience and knowledge, including how best to grow capacity and national ownership, which, by the way, and this won't surprise you, is not necessarily measured by direct funding, and certainly not direct funding to entities that aren't yet able to use it well. What better way to turn Americans against foreign aid than to create failures, especially when we have decades of evidence on what works? We also want to share that the contract mechanism is an excellent way to achieve accountable and transparent results, to which we bring flexibility, innovation, and cost-effective solutions that build enduring human and organizational capacity among NGOs, the local private sector, and government. What do we want to achieve? We want CIDC to become a respected and sought-out voice on international development. We want development companies to be positively viewed as important implementing partners. We want contracts to be viewed and valued for their excellence in delivering high-impact, transparent, and accountable aid with measurable results. Okay, back to the process. Over the next several months, we held 2 key consultations with our whole community, and of course did a lot of legwork between the meetings. Ultimately, in mid-March, at a meeting at Creative, we made the following decisions. We decided to nest CIDC within the PSC as an independent and autonomous body with our own governance and dues structure. We elected an executive committee and invited all members to serve on the CEO Board of Governors. We hired a coalition administrator who works out of the PSC. We hired a public affairs company, the Podesta Group, which serves us in ways similar to what Liz Schreier and Associates does for the US GLC, what the Glover Park Group does for MFAM. And we created a revenue-based dues structure. Currently, we are very proud to say that we are at 55 members and growing. Interestingly, 30 of those 55 members are small businesses. We celebrated our internal launch at Crown Agents on May 18th, 2011, and our public launch on June 22nd. A 6-month process from start to finish. The fact that this happened so quickly and seamlessly is a comment on the need and our own agility to meet a need. So what do? We have a number of task forces led and staffed by our member companies, which reach out to the media, the Hill, the administration, third parties, and of course, like any membership organization, we have internally focused task forces on membership. We also have a lot of information and case studies on our website, www. American Ingenuity Abroad. The name says it all. Some features of that website are up on the screen today. You'll enjoy getting to know it when you have a chance, and you'll find a lot of examples of the work our member companies do. George Ingram commented that we may be playing a unique role in sharing cases of real development impact and what works. Let me just talk for a minute about some myths and assumptions, which our website also tries to address. We know from our first efforts that we need to do a better job of letting people know that most of our staff in developing countries are nationals, citizens of the country, many of which go on to major leadership positions that draw greatly on the professional development and mentoring we provide. That we usually have 1 to 2 expatriates on any given team. That we work with and through a vast number of local partners, NGOs, government entities, private companies. That a very high proportion of our funds go to these local partners, helping them to do the work in new ways and building their capacity in sustainable ways. That the 1 to 2 expatriates and our own companies bring in new think that is critical to catalyzing change. That we have very advanced processes for building capacity and fostering national ownership. That contracts are amazing platforms for catalyzing innovation, for providing transparent and accountable results, and for lowering costs through competition. That the discipline of the bottom line is as critical an engine in this context as in many others for eking out the most for every dollar, including technical innovation, replication, and what we all really want, scale up to get the kind of change that will really make a dent in poverty in our lifetimes. That in 2005, USAID analyzed the total relative cost of grants, cooperative agreements, and contracts, and reported to Congress that there was no appreciable cost difference between them. Finally, importantly, that we believe that there is a role for all implementing partners, whether private sector or nonprofit, and that by bringing all possible talent to this huge challenge, we will succeed better. Let me end where I began. We formed because we were being lumped with other kinds of government contractors. By forming, we are recognizing our responsibility to be at the table, to go to bat in defense of the knowledge we have of what works in development and what the private sector brings to the effort. Frankly, this is another form of being a good taxpayer, helping to bring our knowledge forward so that it will be used to help ensure that government funds are well spent. We want to upend the myths and assumptions and be part of the evidence that helps build good policy and good development. While we will not always be popular, we are showing how very committed we are to development, to ending poverty, and to helping grow wealth and opportunity. Thank you very much.
Thanks. Thank you, Betsy. Asif, I know you've been one of the early members of CIDC. You're a former president of SID-Washington. Perhaps you could share your perspective with us.
Thank you, Dan. I'm going to do it sitting down because I only stand at podiums I can hide behind. And can you hear me? A little closer?
Yeah.
All right, there we go. Thank you, Betsy, and thank you to all of our friends at SID-Washington for hosting us, to Chemonics, and of course to our fearless leader, Dan Runde. It's been a while since I've been introduced under the heading of the new kid on the block. It's been decades, actually. So I'm particularly pleased to be here. I want to talk about three things. I'll start with a few words about CIDC without repeating the very eloquent summary that Betsy gave. And then I want to shift. I want to shift the focus of this discussion from looking inward at ourselves, at CIDC or Interaction or U.S. government, and to look outward at developing countries and their people. I think we need to start with what people need and then to work backward from there to decide what should be provided and who should provide it. And we often get that in the wrong direction. So to me, that's key. I've said it many times, but I don't have time to think new thoughts, so I'll say it again. Development is not what we do. It's what they do. We can only help. And I think that has to stay in the front of our minds. And then I'll close the discussion with why this discussion and why what I have to say is, I think, important to CIDC and I believe important to all in this room and community. Nothing exhaustive, just a few words on each topic on each point to make the point and to spur the discussion. So about CIDC. At the outset, there was uncertainty within the group that formed CIDC, and I'm proud to have been part of that group, about whether we would be seen as something that seeks to divide. And I confess that there was concern that we might ourselves lose track of why we formed it. Any organization, once it starts, tends to have mission creep, and that mission creep might lead to confusing ourselves about why we formed it, and that we would wind up believing that our own words, that we are somehow good, and then wind up believing that we are better than anyone else. That is not why CIDC was formed. That's not what it is about, and I'm pleased to report that 6 months later, that is not the way CIDC is developing. We are not here to divide, but rather to bring together the community by having a voice that we can participate with others in sharing and in interacting on, and to show more about the complementarity in what we do than in the difference. So CIDC seeks to foster an environment where binaries, for-profits versus not-for-profits, implementers versus government, are broken down so we can focus on our real purpose, which is the pursuit of development success. Again, we can't lose sight of why we exist as a community. And the reality is that the seemingly simple term development encompasses lumps together programs with myriad complex goals and processes that affect hundreds of millions of people. Should affect billions, but doesn't yet, but affects hundreds of millions of people around the world. And there are complex and diverse needs. And smart development policy, and CIDC believes in smart development policy, should leverage the best that America has to offer, whether it comes from our companies, from the not-for-profit community, from think tanks, universities, government, and in many respects, what America has to offer also comes from helping empower those in the developing world who will ultimately be the true forces of change. And the best that America has to offer resides in all of our communities. I've spent a lifetime working to break down the boundaries between various development actors so we can move beyond false dichotomies and sterile debates. I served on the Natural Resources Consultative Committee of World Resources Institute, a not-for-profit, for 7 years. I head an NGO, the Center for Cross-Cultural Communication. I serve on the board of lots of NGOs. I think these distinctions often become silly. We at the CIDC support the goals that USAID has put forward over the past 2 years to improve foreign aid effectiveness, to better measure results, and to promote local capacity building. Betsy cited the fact, and I want to reiterate, that as we did a census of our members as we were forming, what we found is, except for those firms that don't yet have a large international footprint, 90% of our employees are host country nationals. There is tremendous capacity building that happens there, and the experience, whether with an NGO or an international development company, helps bring them up to international standards and helps them achieve things that they could not have achieved without our presence and without that transition. And in the last 3 months alone, I can think of 2 people on our staff who have gone on to who've been named ministers in their home countries. They would not have been able to do that without the experience that they gained. And this is true of all of our IDC partners, as it is true, I think, of our NGO partners. So let me now shift. And we work under contracts, as Betsy said. That's a difference. It's not better, it's not worse. But what contracts do is they give government direct control over our work and our results. And we can be fired in a day. If the government changes its mind about what directions it wants to go in, if the government feels like it wants to stay in the same direction but doesn't like what we're doing, we're gone. That's much more difficult when it is a government employee who's doing things. And that's something that we're proud of because we like being held accountable for results. So let me shift to what I think is the most important part of this discussion, which is what do developing countries and their people and their societies need. And I'm going to speak purely for myself. I do not speak for CIDC in this part of the commentary. I do not speak for IRG. I am too difficult to script, I suspect, for anyone to want to take responsibility for anything that I say. I believe the necessary conditions for development are equitable economic growth and good governance. It doesn't have to be perfect. Look at India and China, who collectively have raised 700 to 800 million people into the middle class in the last 30 years. But I know of no examples in history, and if there are examples, they are the exceptions that prove the rule. And I'm a student, if not a scholar, of economic history. I know of no examples in history where large numbers of people have been lifted out of poverty without 2 conditions being met. Self-sustaining economic growth that creates opportunity and spreads prosperity. And I would love to have a discussion on the use of the term self-sustaining, which is structurally different than sustainable. And the second condition is it hasn't been done. Lifting large numbers of people out of poverty has not been accomplished ever without a reasonably stable, a moderately benign, and a reasonably predictable governance framework. So what does this mean? And this is hard, because many of us have spent time working around governments. But government must work, or the lot of their citizens will not improve at scale. And again, it doesn't have to be perfect. I would neither shock nor offend anyone in this room by saying that this country is not perfect. Those are the goals. But the key to me is to be very careful about making the distinction and not getting confused between goals and means. The implications are huge for programming and for policy. So let's take an example of a hot topic today, because Washington has hot topics, by God. Country ownership. To me, the ultimate goal of country ownership is that countries, societies, and the citizens of those countries own their own destiny and can shape their own future. That is country ownership. It is a goal, but it is not always, depending on the status of the country, the best means. There is a transition to get there, but that is the goal. And in terms of means, I would contend there is no one-size-fits-all. I don't think I would surprise anyone in this room, again, by saying that there are still many countries in the developing world where if you give the cash to the government or to national institutions, that is not necessarily the same as giving the cash to the people of those countries. Because sometimes it just doesn't get there. It goes elsewhere. In fact, it winds up here. And it's not just about cash, it's about assistance. If countries could simply with cash, which is a relatively small amount of cash relative to the challenge that they face, if simply giving them the cash allowed them to do it, that would mean that they have the capacity to do everything, to provide all of the expertise and the technical assistance that they need. Cash is often not the problem. Capacity is the issue. And so we mustn't forget that there are some organizations, though, that have proven themselves capable. And there is an MCC criterion, MCC-like criterion out there, where governments and societies and institutions have proven that they are doing it, that they can do it. Many operate as world-class organizations. Game on. And I think I speak for the CIDC, are all in favor of that. But there are many countries where they're going to continue to need assistance for a period of time to make the transition so they can achieve the true definition of country ownership, which is not needing us. Development is what people, societies, and governments do for themselves. And America's ever more scarce foreign aid dollars have to be targeted to help them get there. And I want to bring up a concept that is gaining great currency, and I think is fundamentally important. We, the donor community, and I lump all of us who receive funds primarily from donor organizations as part of that, are minority shareholders in the development process. Today, 85% of the capital flows from the United States to developing countries come from the private sector, not from the public sector. And if you add to that 85%, the real drivers that are going to shape the future of development, the internet, cell phones, connectivity in a variety of ways, the spread of knowledge, access to ideas, actually that 85% becomes 95%, and we are 5% shareholders. And we've fallen into this false premise, I think, over the last 30 years that somehow the sum of projects is going to be development. It never was, but certainly it ain't now, and it isn't going to be in the future. As a minority shareholder, it does not just change the proportion of what we do, it must change the nature of what we do. Because if we are to leverage that 95%, we have to focus our development assistance resources on making countries the kinds of countries, on helping make countries the kinds of countries that can receive private investment, whether domestic or international, that can help unleash the innate genius of their own people to build a better future. And that has been proven again and again throughout the world with good governance, to allow free access to information and knowledge, to allow a vibrant civil society and a thriving private sector in those countries. So we have to focus our resources, our 5% shareholding, to help leverage the 95%. That's a different role. That's the future, in my opinion. And any organization, and I've said this before, and so foreign aid is a lever, but it is not the driver. The drivers come from non-aid tools. I don't need to belabor that point. I've said before, and I will say again, that except for humanitarian organizations, and there will unfortunately always be a need for immediate humanitarian response around the world, in the developing world, as we will have here at home. But except for those organizations, I believe that any one of the development implementers who are doing substantially the same kinds of things today, in 10 years, as they are doing today, does not deserve to be in business. And the reason for that is that the needs of developing countries are changing rapidly. They are desperately trying to leverage that 95%. And that's what's going on. The Arab Spring was shaped more by connectivity and access to technology than it was by anything we have done, although we all contributed. We can contribute to putting into civil society ideas about freedom and rights. But that's a global phenomenon as well, to which people have had their own independent access. And I think that's a relative strength of the not-for-profit community. It is vital. But then, once people have that, they want electricity. They want roads. And I suspect the role of the for-profit community is vital in those areas, although for every rule there are exceptions. There are not-for-profits that work on electricity provisions. We're working with some in many countries. There are for-profits that work on helping build civil society. So I come back to Dan's concept about a development ecosystem. And we believe in bringing real expertise, transparency, accountability, and again, it is not about what we, the implementers, do. And it creates an important new challenge, not just for us, but for the U.S. government, on how they allocate scarce development dollars as minority shareholders to influence and leverage the 95% of the majority shareholders. Let me close with why this is relevant to the CIDC message. Development ecosystem. I simply do not believe aid has worked in 140 countries. It has presence in 100+ countries in multiple sectors. Each of those countries is at a different stage in development, has different social and internal and political issues. I simply do not believe it is credible to suggest that those needs will best be met by some subsector alone, because the nature of expertise is it exists where it exists, and you have to go out and find it, and it has to be driven by what developing countries need and what their demands are. That is our core message, that the best that America has to offer is offered by nonprofits, by universities, by think tanks, by private companies, and by the private sector as exporters or investors, both domestic and international, and by the government. This is our core message, and it is in support of this core belief that CIDC was formed, and it emerged, and we continue to do our work. So, thank you.
Thank you. So, Asif, we are the 5%. Is that what you're trying to say? We're the 5%.
Yeah,
Okay.
it's not yet the 1%.
We're the 5%.
I look forward to being part of the 1%.
I'm looking
but
forward to
not
part of the
there
1%.
yet.
Exactly. Paul, over to you. A different perspective. SID-Washington board member, vice president of Oxfam. Paul, over to you. Your response to this.
Yeah, I love going after Asif. I couldn't agree more. Back to you, Dan.
Right. Fantastic.
This always happens. No, I'm actually really excited about this. And as long as we can all agree that the non-profits are slightly better, I don't think there's going to be a conflict. No? Okay. Oh, drat. Okay. I love that this idea, this institution, this collection of actors is taking on a bit of momentum because, well, for a lot of reasons, but really because of the time. I think there's a lot at stake. I don't think we are going to be anything like the way we are as a community 5 years from now. It's possible we could be a lot bigger, that people will finally get why this is so important to national security and our long-term economic interests, but it's quite possible we'll be a lot smaller too. There's a lot of antagonists out there. And I think we're being quite honest that one of the reasons we're here is to try and right some misimpressions of our community and why we think about it. But I'm here as a non-profit voice, and I thought it would be most useful, while I share and love so much of what Asif said, to bring a non-profit perspective to the question, why CIDC? Why do we think it's important? And what are my, and I hope they're representative of my non-profits hats, what are our aspirations for what this endeavor might be about and what it might accomplish? And I want to share a couple of reflections from the nonprofit community's experience, and maybe particularly from Oxfam's. One in particular, I'm going to talk a little bit about process and what I think that should lead you to in your discussions as for-profit development firms. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about Asif's substance and what I think some of the really important implications are, but also, again, from what we've learned on our side. So on process, here's what I'll say to you. I don't think it's smart to spend much time defending the industry. I think it's smart to spend time defending the ideas and be willing to let the wheat separate from the chaff as you do so. And for that, I think you're going to have ideas, and then you're going to have an investment in getting them into the right forums in the right ways. And here's an experience from our side. Oxfam is an organization that believes deeply in the importance of changing the political power around a lot of the development challenges. To do that, we have to have political power. So we're unapologetic about trying to accumulate political power for our agenda in certain contexts. But here's what we find. When we go out there with a primary mission to increase our power, it rarely succeeds. When we go out and spend a fortune on give money to Oxfam posters or try and get a journalist to take interest in have you heard about what Oxfam's doing? The journalists look at us and go, I was 20 years ago maybe, but not today. When we go out there and say, here's our view on what we think is a discussion that's in play around the development agenda, or we put a poster up in National Airport that says, think about the broader development agenda. Forget about Oxfam. Oxfam's the tiny little thing in the corner. Think about the development agenda. Do we, as Americans, want to be leaders or not? Then two things happen. One, the numbers we get back on people who actually look at us when we step into a debate is so much higher than the numbers that feed back to us when we say just look at us. And we change the power dynamics around the question. So what does that mean? It means that I hope that CIDC both provides itself but leads in development for-profit development firms to take seriously investing in two things. One, R&D and leading the development debate, your R&D departments, knowing where US aid is likely to be if they had the time and expertise 2-3 years from now, or at least being able to engage them on that. And two, policy and advocacy. In the NGO world, if you're the head of a major operational NGO, you're probably in a meeting a week on some kind of policy advocacy initiative. You're being asked to be a voice on some or other issue. Now, I know Asif spends a lot of time on this kind of stuff because it's what he wants to do, and he's developed a certain type of profile on that. But I would challenge quite a few of the heads and VPs of development consulting firms. How much of their week do they budget for representation and policy advocacy to change the shape of the discussion? They are perhaps the most thoughtful, experienced, and potentially powerful voices, but I'm not sure they budget half as much as your average NGO CEO, and I'm not sure that's right. So it's a challenge in the attempt to be provocative. Okay, so those are a couple of process comments. I think if you do invest more in that, you will change the debate, not just in your own sector and not just for nonprofits, but the entire development community, because I think we are begging for new ideas. And here's an example. I'm going to get onto substance now. Let's say Asif is right. Let's say he's right that the whole development discussion is going to be about self-sustaining economic growth and good governance in the years to come. And a good chunk of it already is. What would that mean for the kind of thinking and discussions that we would engage in, and what would we have to get an awful lot better at if we were going to lead that discussion? What might those R&D and policy advocacy departments focus on? Well, here's 3 provocations for you, which I hope aren't entirely daft. 1, the biggest, the worst epiphany we ever had was when we thought we'd got it right by teaching people how to fish. That the real problem with development was never stuff, which was give them fish, but it wasn't teaching them how to fish. The real problem stopping self-sustaining economic growth is that somebody doesn't want them to know how to fish that well. There are all these structural, institutional, and here's the big word, power dynamics out there that are making sure that if all these people living in poverty learn how to fish, it still isn't going to solve the problem because we're just not set up to tackle. The real problem is power. What if, here's my provocation, the development community has been going on a journey from stuff to capacity to power. And now many of us are thinking about power in new dimensions. Now, power is one of those words that starts to sound really ideological and somewhat non-profity sometimes. But let's talk about solid proxies for power. Here's the way I interpret something that Asif said. You know what the best proxy for power is? Money. Or at least it's a pretty good one. Money. What Asif said is 95% of the power out there, the big money flows, isn't aid. But if we could take our 5% and change the power dynamics around those flows, all that extractive industries monies that's being taken out of those countries, oil, minerals, and gas, is it ending up in poor communities? For the most part, not. All those big new deals between corporations and governments where there isn't an awful lot of transparency in those deals, or the government doesn't have either the will or the capacity to take that deal, do it in its own best interest, publish the terms of it, and get the money out to communities to build up what we care about, the raw materials of self-sustaining economic growth. What's that? Better educated communities, healthier communities, places where you can get jobs and do all that kind of stuff. What if we were to devote our time and energy to following all that money, all those 90% flows, and helping to make sure that more of those flows lead to self-sustaining economic growth? Find their way into communities. Would that open up new kinds of contracts, new kinds of business? Would it take the development discussion a step forward? I would suggest yes. Here's the second provocation. I think we're kind of there. I don't actually think I've said anything that provocative, but I think we're on step 1 of a two-step equation. The thing we've gotten a lot better at, in the end of the day, I think we've kind of realized collectively all this largesse isn't going to do much until these governments, and this is the second part of Asif's equation, the good governance part, until these governments have both the capacity and the political will to collect all the monies they can, domestic revenue mobilization, get the best deals out of the oil corporations or the other natural resource sales, and then spend it wisely. We're not going to get there. So many of us, I used to work for what was Bearing Point, KPMG, spent a lot of our time trying to make sure those governments have great ministries of finance and can actually allocate those budgets to the right ministries, and those ministries spend their monies effectively. And many of you are engaged in that in ways that are much more knowledgeable than I'll ever be. But that's step 1 of the two-step equation, in my view. The second step, and I have to say my community, the NGO community, is a problem here, is that those governments might get capacity, but they won't sort out their power problems until somebody's going to get very good at holding them accountable. And we're still struggling with the second step, which is the accountability question. And our best answer we've come up with so far is the only folks that can really hold them accountable effectively outside of global governance mechanisms, and most legitimately, are their own people. We want citizens to be empowered to hold their governments accountable so those monies are spent well. That's the democratic project right now. That's why Asif didn't just say sustained economic growth, he said democracy and governments, in my view, or at least that's what I chose to hear. So, are we any good, really, at strengthening civil society to be effective at holding their governments accountable? The NGOs have been in it, frankly, longer than the for-profits, and I'm not sure we're that good in it. And part of it is that we haven't unraveled the third challenge that I will put to us, which I think is going to be really where the rub is at the end of the day. The third challenge is this, and the US is leading the way for better or worse. The US has sort of decided a few years ago it is too hard to defend the development project as a whole. We have got to focus more on success. We've got to focus more on those countries that are demonstrating success. So we got MCC. They've demonstrated, they've met some criteria. We've got Partnership for Growth. You know how many countries Partnership for Growth focuses on? 4. It's pretty hard to be a Partnership for Growth country. The idea that the US is now engaged in is if we can just demonstrate that we can accelerate growth in just a small set of countries where the conditions for growth exist, we can perhaps build more support for the development agenda more generally. So that's where the momentum is going. It's going that way. The other place it's going, of course, is, well, we can't forget about the complete humanitarian disasters in the geostrategic countries. No matter what you say, you're still going to have your Afghanistans and your Iraqs. And many of us have cut our teeth in those environments. So we can feel pretty confident, either because of the American heart or because of our national security interests or whatever, that if things get really, really bad and places are complete basket places, we'll be there. And we're going to be in the success stories. So that's great. That only leaves us about 160 countries to worry about. Bad governments, lack of political will. Oh, they know all about power, but they're not interested in hearing a discussion about democratization and accountability and all this kind of stuff. Nobody has that answer. How do you actually achieve sustained or self-sustaining economic growth and good governance in the 160 countries where the government hasn't demonstrated sufficient political capacity or will? And by the way, if you start talking about civil society, there's probably an NGO law that will get you kicked out. And if there isn't, they're going to come up with one. And frankly, they don't really need a law because those are the kind of environments where they just know how to exercise power in arbitrary and capricious ways to keep things just as they are. Well, my bet is there's going to be a $100 million contract for the international for-profit consulting firm that can say, we have an answer to that. Now, it isn't easy, and it isn't going to happen in a year, but we have an answer to that. We've got experts in it, we've got tools, we've got ideas, and we've got a proposal for you. And I think that's where the R&D would be, and that's where the policy advocacy discussion ought to be. And I'm frankly not sure that the NGOs are going to be there as competitors on it because we don't think in 9-figure sums. We'll do our part at the community level, but somebody needs to be thinking about how to tackle this at a much, much bigger level. And that's one reason why I'm so excited that this body is here and that Asif is sort of throwing out some of these ideas, and Betsy too, in the sense that this is trying to move the discussion forward. Not simply defend us for what we wear, but defend the possibility of what we could be as a community if we got a larger constituency to care about the importance of development. And I do fundamentally believe, as somebody who's about to become an American, and there's nothing worse than a convert if you want a zealot, that this is the country that should be leading the debate. So let's have at it. That's it.
Oh, my fellow American. Congratulations. That's great news. That is a reason for applause. I'm going to take advantage of being the moderator to put out a couple questions to the panel, then I'm going to open it up. But I think there are a number of elephants in the room that I think we've touched on or touched various parts of the elephant. But I think I want to put a couple of things out there. Let me put to the panel the issue of local capacity building. There's a lot of energy now about, well, aren't we, and we've talked about this a little bit, but let me just push on this a little bit further. Local capacity building, it's important. Shouldn't we be certainly in many contexts in my mind, I can think my view would be Pakistan would be one. I don't think we should be doing local capacity building, but I can think of places like Partnership for Growth that, yeah, perhaps we should be doing local capacity building, or higher upper middle income countries. Can we just talk a little bit about this? There seems to be a lot of energy coming from the administration. There's there's a lot of discussion about the why that's a good thing, and I don't think it's good in all contexts. But perhaps I could just get some reactions to this issue of local capacity building. Let me start with Asif, and then I'd like the others to respond. Asif, can I put you on the spot?
It's a tough one. Let me start out by saying that ultimately local capacity building is something that happens in a myriad of ways. And so a program that we call local capacity building isn't just what it's about. and to stray a little bit, what has been called the brain drain, for those of us who are schooled in development early in our careers, has in fact become a brain gain, where some of the greatest capacity building comes from people who left their countries, who learned to work in functional institutions and environments, and who are bringing those skill sets back in ways that we cannot to their own countries. And I know many people in Pakistan as well, but certainly the best example is India. India has benefited tremendously from locals, and I hate the term locals, but nationals, gaining capacity and then bringing it back and institutionalizing and embedding it in their own societies. And that cultural embedding is something that is what we cannot do. So local capacity building is first and foremost a local issue. But I think you're hitting on a key point, and Paul and Betsy both addressed it, that in the end, we have to focus our efforts on building capacity where we can for those things that are critical to leveraging the other 95%. I think the IDCs and the NGOs do an enormous amount of that you don't get from 0 to 60 in an instant. It takes a while. That's one of our big challenges politically in this country. To establish that it takes a while. It's taken us 50 years, but there has been an enormous amount of progress, and we're going to see tremendous changes in the next several years. I think capacity building best comes from doing things, and there I think the flows of private capital are already changing people and societies because they're learning new skills. I was at a session with you, Dan, yesterday, at CSIS, and with some others in this room, Rodney and a few others who may be here, about the fact that large companies need to build the capacity of their workers, of their managers, and they need to interact with the local authorities. So all of these forces are part of local capacity building. I think it is essential, and it happens as part of the other things that are driving changes in development. And access to knowledge and information, I think, is doing a great deal for that.
Topic, local capacity building, the other panelists. Paul, Betsy.
I agree with that, and I'll be brief. If you were to change the word, if you bought the part of my argument that says that the real kind of capacity you want is actually more about power, so building local power rather than just skills, because capacity building as a technical thing, I don't think there are much threats to. I think we're actually quite good at it. But where it gets really important is if you're trying to help local communities use information better, hold other institutions accountable better, and so on. I agree very much with Asif said, but I would add a dimension. We're at our most effective when we turn our cross-border reality into an asset. I'll give you a specific example. So extractive industries revenues in Ghana are the transformative tool in that environment. They've got the highest growth in the world last year, 17%. Most of the money's coming from oil. But the problem is that money going to go to the right places? And how will you build local capacity to make sure that it does? Well, most of the effort that we spent was to just get the data about the deals between the companies and the government publicized. And then when we got that, and we got a law passed in the Dodd-Frank law, so that if you deal on the U.S. the New York Stock Exchange, you have to publish the terms of those deals. It's in implementation now at the SEC. But once you get that passed, your capacity building challenge changes, because now we're working with 200 Ghanaian civil society organizations on how to use that information in their own interests to hold the government accountable. So the real capacity strengthening work we did, the point I'm trying to make, actually happened outside the country, not in the country, because with that data, they build their own capacity at some level. What we did do was bring them together and show them the information. The one last thing I'll say is, it's one thing to do it in Ghana, but what if we tried to do the same thing in Angola, which has oil? and not a government that would allow that. I think the real challenge is, how do you do local capacity building where people don't want that capacity built, and answering that challenge.
Betsy, here you go.
Oh, thanks. Well, you know, we've gotten very complicated about the way that we're talking about capacity building. I think, you know, there's the technical capacity to do the work in a given organization. There's their institutional capacity to support that work and all of what goes with that. And where we've sort of complicated the discussion, and I think when you say the elephant in the room, it's about capacitating organizations to be direct recipients from the donor and have a direct relationship. And whether that in itself, being a direct recipient, a direct awardee, is a measure of development success. I mean, what are we trying to build? Are we trying to build organizations that can, government, private sector, that can carry out the work and have the institutions to be able to support it? Are we trying to create organizations that can receive direct funding? It's a big issue recently. I think that's kind of really the if you say, elephant in the room. You know, we've been doing capacity building for a very long time. It is not something new, and I think that we all look at it that way. A few years ago, when this conversation started on capacity building, and we had the SID Acquisition and Assistance Task Force going, we were asked by Maureen Shaikh to give examples, and we went out to the SID community, and we got 199 responses. It's a very interesting document that really reflects a lot of input from our entire community, nonprofit, for-profit, and so on, about what people think works. But they're talking about building technical capacity, they're talking about building institutional capacity. This new idea about being able to be capacitated to be a direct awardee, that's a new concept. It's one you have to rush to. I'm just coming back from spending a wonderful assignment in Bangladesh, where we are trying to capacitate 26 NGOs who are part of a massive franchise with 323 clinics and so on. We're trying to capacitate them to be stronger organizations. We've involved them in what I think is the cutting edge and best process for doing that, which is a self-assessment process, where they define the goal, where they define where they are and where they want to be and how they're going to get there. We all know that that's the kind of ownership that actually has to happen if you're going to move any entity along, no matter what kind of entity it is. And so we're doing that with them, and it's a very beautiful example where we're working with a local private sector company called Capacity Building Services Group. AID probably hasn't gone back to see, but in fact, it grew out of a former AID project 9 years ago, now is a thriving national business, and they're actually doing the work with these 26 NGOs. So it's empowering a local company, it's empowering 26 local NGOs that are involved in health services, and it's going along really well. However, we have to, come to grips with the conundrum. Are we capacitating them to do the work technically and to be strong institutions to support that work, or are we capacitating them for direct assistance? And we are actually doing the latter. And it takes us in a different direction, and a tough direction, because the truth is it's a really different set of requirements. And I sort of enjoyed the fact that the COTR said to them all at the workshop that we held at the end of December, be sure to read the website because it includes all of the USAID rules and regs. And I'm like, okay, that would be my remedy for insomnia, okay? Right. That is not the way they're going to learn that. So I think we've got a lot of experience on capacity building, and I think that we have some new conundrums that we're trying to figure out how to do them well, and leave organizations in a really good place where they can contribute to long-term development and not be detoured, whatever, into places that really are not relevant to development outcomes.
Thank Let me put one more out on the table, and this I think reflects I think a concern within AID and other large government agencies is, and there's an ongoing discussion or thinking about this, but should all of there's almost a sense that or a desire to have all of the development expertise be in-house, if you will, within government. There's a fear almost of, is government outsourcing its thinking as opposed to outsourcing work, if you will? I get some reactions to this issue, or this, because I think some of what's driving some of the discussion in Washington, at least, and beyond any administration, I think this is sort of an ongoing concern about what's the balance between policy, program design and policy design and the work. And I've been in other organizations like parts of the World Bank Group where they try and do it all themselves, and there are all sorts of limitations to that model. I actually don't think that doesn't actually make a lot of sense, and it's a model that I've seen parts of the World Bank system use. So maybe I could just get people to respond to that, because I think that we'll get some interesting perspectives. Paul, let me start with you.
Sure. Well, it's said that the Irish came up with the saying, "Is this a private fight or can anyone join in?" I love a good scrap, but this is the stupidest scrap I've ever heard. Should development capacity sit with the government, or should it sit with international firms and NGOs, is daft. It's not like collectively we've got the whole thing solved. We need a far stronger USAID, MCC, and so on. And the first thing we'll need as they get stronger is more capacity to think and work alongside them. This is about whether you believe the project is important and we've got the answers, and yes to the first and no to the second. So any attempt to build up for-profit firms or NGOs, if we can't educate people that is not going to come at the cost of a strong US government voice and capacity, we're really not doing our jobs well.
Let me get Asif, and we'll just go down the line, and then we'll open it up.
There are real issues about the range of expertise that you can have in government. And again, think about the 160 countries that Paul talked about and the diverse needs, and about flexibility. If you shift sectors, are you going to be able to grow the government capacity in that area in a short period as new needs arise that you haven't defined? It's going to be very difficult. Every organization, public or private, outsources certain functions that are not part of their core mandate. And in fact, those of us who fear that we might be successful in development and work ourselves out of a job, at my age, that's not much of a fear. But for those who are coming into the development community, actually developed countries and large corporations use consultants and outside advisors more than poor countries do. So there's always a need for state-of-the-art expertise, and the state-of-the-art will always be drawn from a community of providers. So I completely agree with Paul. Of course we want a stronger U.S. government, because what USAID has been reduced to over the last 20 years is a contracting organization. And when you're dealing with a contracting organization, the dirty little secret in our business is that there is no such thing as a successful program without an excellent client. And so it is that capacity. They are the ones who bring the vision, the leadership, the guidance to help us shape, implement programs. And often we respond to programs that they have designed. So aid needs to be strengthened. But it would be, I think, a mistake to expect that all programs that aid implements can be done simply by aid staff. There are going to be times when they need the best in the world in this or that area where they simply don't have the bench strength. And if they did, aid would be a 25,000 person organization as it was during the Vietnam era. And I at least don't see that happening anytime in the near future.
I don't know if I'll say anything really that much different than what Paul and Asif has said, except for, I think there's just some issue that occurs when one looks at these programs internationally versus domestically. I don't think there's any sort of domestic part of government that has the same fear of contracting out. Now, you know, I should be careful because that's not my area, domestic, but I think, you know, what we want to achieve through government is the same kind of leveraging that Asif was describing about what we're trying to do in a developing country. We want the 5% to be focused on getting the 95%. So we are like a fan that increases the capacity of government to achieve its goals by using all of these outsourced services. Just like as a small business, I'm not going to grow an HR department. I'm going to go out and buy HR services. I'm going to go out and buy financial and accounting services. And same thing with the U.S. government, from their perspective, is buy all of this and you can achieve so much more. And, you know, it's not feasible for them in these financial times ever to grow to the place where they could do all of this themselves. And yet, on the other hand, and I want to really emphasize what Asif said, if within the government, within the client, there isn't somebody who is really knowledgeable, then they and we will fly blind, and it will really get in the way of the work. So you want expertise there to support the work that's being done, and I know we all feel this way, to write really good scopes of work. Because if we don't have a good scope of work, we can't do what? Write a good proposal. So the expertise has to be there, but not for implementation.
Okay, I'm going to open it up, but I'm going to take advantage of the fact that I know several people in the audience, and so I'm going to start. We have microphones. I'm going to start. I'd like to get Rodney Bent's reaction to what he's heard, our former past SID-Washington president. And I know there are going to be a series of other folks who are interested parties. Rodney.
I was fascinated because I want to see if I could blend all three panel participants. I think Asif is excuse me, 100% right about the good governance, and I take good governance as meaning transparency and accountability in a real sense, which bleeds over into Paul's point, which is what is power about? It's when an informed electorate actually gets to make a decision. I don't think any country in the world does a particularly good job of it. If you go out and pick up the U.S. budget, you'd be hard-pressed to know, well, so who does what and how well do they do it? I think I want to come back to also one point that Betsy made on capacity building. I think of capacity building as the way of using our 5% of resources to leverage the 95%. I think one issue is that for aid and for MCC and others, if it becomes capacity building is you now will do what we want you to do the way we would want you to do by reading aid regulations, it completely misses the point. The 95% is where the money is. You want countries and companies and projects to attract the 95% through rule of law, through good court systems, through land tenure, through ways of bringing more sustained results that will last dozens and hundreds of years, not sort of the length of an aid contract. So I want to take it a little bit further. End of commentary.
Okay, let's open it up. Show of hands. I think I see Steve Mosley, leader in the NGO community, and also involved with SID-Washington for many years, former president of SID-Washington. Steve.
Thanks. First of all, I want to congratulate you for all of your presentations. I think it's a very wonderfully healthy, open, transparent discussion to find out that the range of interests of the commercial development organizations and the NGO organizations, let's say represented by Interaction, or they're not all represented by Interaction, actually come around the bend and have exactly the same concerns and agenda and interest in results and hard-driving investment that will enable other people to achieve the work that they should be in charge of. What I wanted to ask you a question about, though, and which I think is in front of all of us to work together in this field across that spectrum, is the larger context in which these elephants that I behind you about how the U.S. government is defining country ownership, about how the U.S. government wants to define a change in foreign aid, is the larger context in which there have been international agreements among countries with international multilateral donors, the Paris Accord, the Ghana Accords, the Paris Declarations, and so forth, which mandates putting clearly the ownership and the responsibility and the leadership of foreign assistance primarily in the hands of many of it wanted it to be people, but the governments, unfortunately, what it becomes, who are not ready fully to do that. But that's the law of the official policy at the moment. And you haven't really talked about that. And unless both the new CIDC and Interaction and many others start better defining how their capacity and purpose and mission and values will relate to that larger context, we're going to find ourselves significantly criticized in the cynicism, just in there, that I don't think the commercial community should feel any more attacked about the cynicism about failures of development. The NGO community is exactly likewise by many of the liberal leaders in the Democratic Party who are concerned with foreign aid, very cynical now about what has evolved from all of this, and who are these people receiving all this money to do the good when it perhaps should be really in the hands of others in their view to do that. So larger context, please.
Thank you, Steve. I think you put your finger on something very important. Let me start with Paul and perhaps get some other reactions from the panel.
I do think it's a key question, and I'd go back to what I said earlier and then say this. If it's true that the big challenge in that respect, well, look, just think about where Congress is and how it takes any kind of waste or unexplainable use of U.S. taxpayer dollars and what our challenge is in that respect. In response to that and other concerns that people have, they're at the heart of Steve's comments, we've tried something. We've tried setting up parallel systems, standing alongside governments and civil society and training them on how to better manage their affairs. And either hold people accountable or be more accountable. And the basic reality around the parallel systems approach is it doesn't have a lot of political traction anymore. People are skeptical that not giving folks any kind of control over their own agenda, but training them to one day take the lead by workshopping them to death, is actually a viable development approach. So, knowing that that doesn't work, we've said, okay, maybe the only way to learn is to do. How are we going to invest with and through flawed governments, weak civil society, and bring enough to that equation so that the money doesn't get lost and open up the antagonists in Congress to the food frenzy we know that some of them would like to engage in? And that is our challenge. We've got to get much better. I think, frankly, at the heart of your question, there are some people in the leadership of the administration, and a few in Congress, not many in Congress, who are a little ahead of us in that. They've sort of said, I don't care what you folks are saying. We're going to give money to governments. I don't care if you make us nervous about it. We're going to give money to governments. And many of us, including folks in those government institutions, said, we better work out how the hell to do this because they don't seem to want to stop saying it. And I frankly think that was courageous leadership, and we should get better at it.
Other views? Asif?
I just agree with you, Steve. I think it's a huge issue, and it's typical of the kinds of issues we're facing today. A principle in which we all believe, but the practice is much muddier, and you're talking to people who haven't been in the mud and don't understand how it is muddier. I'm given some hope from the fact that this government has signed treaties and declarations in the past without, in fact, adhering to them. So it may not all happen. But I think we're going to be facing a CNN moment, which is when CNN or some other network does an expose on what happened to the money that was given directly to X or Y government.
Yeah.
And that can have the tremendous effect on changing the political dynamic, and I think will. And will scare people about the need for some accountability and some parallel track. But I also think we are in need, and this goes back to something Paul referred to earlier, getting back to the issue of power. I have been looking for a long time. I've seen something like it in Southeast Asia because each country wants to meet a standard of the tigers, and then there's China, and there's a framework. In Latin America, there was for a while, and there are a few countries that have dropped out, but there still is a strong framework. In Africa, there isn't. And I used to say what we need is the equivalent of an EU effect, where countries have to become better countries, have to manage better because they want accession to the EU. Well, the EU is not quite that,
Right now.
So I don't use EU effect
Until about 5
anymore.
years, until about 2 years ago.
Yeah, the effect formerly known as EU. But we need some external incentive, some external framework where countries have an incentive, and we don't talk enough about elites. And elites have been a bad word since we got into poorest of the poor. But it's in fact the elites who are going to shape a lot of what happens in the world, and it's not all a bad thing. That's who builds countries. And as long as it can be done in a way that doesn't impoverish, but rather creates wealth for the poor, as I think is happening in India with tremendous problems. But 300 million people ain't bad. It's better than what we've done. So we need some kind of an external force that will help countries behave. And I don't yet know what that force is, particularly in Africa.
Well, I mean, I think that part of why CIDC came into being is in order to really help preempt the CNN moments. And to just, and frankly, we've already been working very much in that area in terms of trying to make sure that the government to government kind of interpretation and application of national ownership is done in a way that won't lead to those CNN moments. And that's been a big effort for us. I'm very pragmatic. I think when it comes back to actually how we deal with this as good development professionals, we do a lot of it in implementation. And it isn't to be defined just by government to government, but it's how, in fact, we help create the national ownership through implementation that will lead to that successful outcome. We do that because we respond to RFPs by talking to a lot of people in country, structuring our responses in ways that reflect those discussions, but yet try to take the solution a little bit further than would ever happen in country. That's one of the problems with national ownership when you're talking about technical, new think, and bringing people to new places is, you know what? If it was going to be nationally, completely already owned, they wouldn't need us, we wouldn't be there, and it already would have happened. And that isn't the case. We're there in order to bring along a new kind of thinking and a new outcome. So we're all ultimately sort of midwives, okay, helping to birth a new solution, a new way of doing things, a new way of thinking. And when we're successful at that, we're doing it in such a way, and, you know, Paul said workshop to death, and I think, you know, that's what we try not to do. We try to, you know, advance that common notion, getting to that new place. And it isn't just government to government. It's people, it's organizations, it's NGOs, it's the private sector, and it includes government.
Let me just take my moderator hat off for a second on this issue of budget support, because I know that that's one of the responses to this issue of, okay, we have these international treaties and local capacity building is to support is through budget support. I mean, the U.S. government got out of budget support 30 years ago because of all the bad experiences, and I think that, and I even think the U.K. is moving away from it. That's too flippant to say, well, in all contexts it's bad. But I think, I'm not known for this, but I think we need to have a degree of nuance on this issue of saying, well, okay, local capacity building through local partners good, or local budget support good because we're responding to international treaties. I do believe we can respond to this impetus about capacity building and country ownership through modalities that we currently use. So I'm nervous about the issue overselling this issue of budget support because it's caused us all sorts of trouble in the past. And I think in this environment, in an age of austerity, with a much harder set of questions about what we're doing with that money, it's going to be very hard for me to go to have any accountability with family members of mine who don't live in the Beltway and aren't in the development community to explain what happened to the money when it went down, quote unquote, a rat hole. That's not completely fair, but that's the perception that's often generated. Okay, gentleman here, a woman here. If you could identify yourself and.
Russell Michelov, no current institutional affiliation. I wanted to get back a little bit, to the role, the prospective role, of CIDC. And I was particularly taken by Paul's comment, which I agree with entirely, that we should not be, we're not here to defend the industry, but we're here to defend the ideas. And prominent among those ideas is the idea that stuff doesn't matter very much. Capacity may to some degree, but in the last analysis, power is even more important. I agree there also. But I'm not sure that I can go from there to suggesting what the agenda for CIDC ought to be. I think, Paul, you suggested a certain amount of R&D, devoting resources to R&D. But I don't quite know how one uses R&D to address the issue that you were getting to. Certainly we can, I suppose, do a few case studies on where there has been success. In countries in which citizens have come to hold power and hold government accountable. But that doesn't really translate, I don't think, very well to I think we mentioned the 150 countries which are neither security concerns nor obvious successes. And I don't quite know how you get there. I don't know what the R&D might look like.
Okay, thank you. I'm gonna bunch these questions together. I'm gonna have the lady over here, and I'm gonna get a third question. Then I'd ask the panelists to take one of them and not answer all three of them. And that way we can maybe do a second round as well. Please, ma'am.
Hi, I'm Patricia DeVecchio, International Purpose, and first I want to thank the panel for all the information. To me, it always comes back to people, not to power, not to external capacity building, but it comes to developing people. And are we really looking at that to the degree that we need to? Are we developing self-awareness? Are we developing self-confidence? Are we developing self-assertiveness, responsibility, courage, accountability? Are we developing self-accountability? Because unless we start there, it's very difficult to help hold any institution, government, etc. accountable unless we're first accountable to ourselves. And I think it's a lot harder to do. It's a lot harder to facilitate the development of the softer skills than it is the harder skills. But to me, that's the core, and that's something that's really missing in terms of capacity building.
Third question. Let me come over here. There's a woman in the back row. Back there in the white coat, and we'll keep those three. And then I know there's a series of other hands, and we'll try and get to them.
Hello. Hi. My name is
Hi,
Jasmine
guys.
Junk. I'm Georgetown University, and I'd just like to know your opinion. Do you feel that China's stepping into development now in their indiscriminate manner of giving aid, is that going to be any hindrance to CIDC is trying to do?
Okay, folks. Take one of the questions each. Paul.
Okay. I think there are three interesting questions.
Or if you want to take, why don't we have
I'll take the
brief,
last
brief
one.
and okay,
Yeah?
fine,
I'll
China.
take whichever one the others don't.
Take the China one.
You go
Paul.
ahead, Asif.
Let me take the one on people. I have seen remarkable achievements by people when their innate genius is in an environment that unleashes that genius and that empowers. And so let's be specific. The Arab Spring was an assertion of self-confidence, of self-awareness by people, but I do not think you can separate people from the societies and communities in which they live. And so it's a complex interaction. So how did they get that? Well, there were a lot of civil society efforts from around the world to help build that. There were projects. But ultimately, interestingly, they went out, and there's a great sociologist who did work that I was very familiar with and with whom I worked in the early 80s, Cecil Cook, who then went off to South Africa to work on issues there, who talked about technology in those days, but the same is true for ideas, as best transmitted not when you try to give it to somebody, but when you have an environment in which they can say, you got it, I don't, and they reach out and they grab it. And that's what the internet, I mean, the second Iranian revolution almost happened on Twitter. The Tunisian and Egyptian revolutions happened on Twitter and Facebook and the internet and cell phones and flash mobs. So I think the greatest development of people will be a country that invests in education. It's a problem here, too. And the access to what the world offers them today. And why are we seeing so much more tumult in the world? It's because people have actually gained self-awareness that they grabbed through tools that existed elsewhere in the world. So there's the twin thing of investing in the people through education, through health, through all the things that allow people to function, but giving them access to ideas that transform them and their communities.
Okay, well, I'm going to leave Paul with China, and I'll take the R&D agenda and use it as an opportunity to mention that, I don't think our aim is to defend the industry. That is not at all what we are about. Our objective is to be part of the evidence about what works and where we need to go, and to take responsibility for being in the space. And I take Paul's point, and I agree with it. While I think that there are members of the international development company community that do spend time with USGLC, with SID. I mean, SID has really benefited from the huge investment made by the international development company community. And when you look at who has been president, who's on the board, who's giving a ton of time. But are we spending enough? Are we creating the space that we need? Are we giving the time that we need? And what I think we're saying, and what I tried to weave into my comments, is no. The answer is we are coming to a new place and a new space, and we're saying we want to give it more time, and we want to create a space for ourselves at the table, not to defend the industry, but to help engage in development of ideas on what is good development, what have we learned, what do we know. And it's fun because there is so much surprise out there about the incredible depth of expertise that resides in this community that hasn't sufficiently been at the table. So it's kind of a maturation for us. It's a very fun, I call it a Rubicon, to cross and to be a part of that. Does it require a whole R&D agenda? Not necessarily, because part of it is bringing forward what we know, what we're doing, what works, and really being engaged in that discussion. There will be times where we may talk about R&D, and certainly we seek to be not as prodigious as the NGO community in our writing, but to try to step up to the plate and bring more writing, bring more thinking, bring more research, and really engage and help to shape the future.
Thank you. Okay,
I do have some thoughts on China, if I could.
please, on China. Sorry.
Okay, and I'm going to cheat just a second. here.
Broken China. Broken.
Yes, and I'm going to say them in Mandarin. I can't. I gotta cheat just a little bit. One line on people. I think we should do the Serenity Prayer more often. Honestly. One line on R&D, we should answer Dan's question, budget support. That's what we should be doing R&D on. He's right about the politics of it, but he may be wrong about the content of it. I was with Raj Shah yesterday for half an hour. You know what he was talking about? Host country contracting. You know what that is? Okay. They are thinking about it, so you can decide whether you want to. Okay, let's talk about China. I think the G20 is a lark. I don't think the G20 is ever going to get its act together. There's a G2. There is a G2, and it's going to be a battle that gets fought ideologically over the next 10 years. Are we going to go with an American view of development, or are we going to go with a Chinese view of development? And guess who's got the money? So we better have the ideas. Because China doesn't think right now about self-sustaining economic growth, because it's got to keep up a 10% level of rate, and it sure as hell doesn't think that development doesn't last without democracy and governance in all these countries. Its idea is be more humble, don't be hypocritical, and ask very few questions. So they are going to be dealing with government, and they're going to be asking them piles of questions. We are going to be dealing with countries who have a serious choice about a G2, and we better be able to offer a good package to those countries that is in the United States' long-term interests, but also in theirs. And I just don't think of anyone who can answer the Chinese question better than the United States, but I think it has to.
Less conditionality and less earmarks, right, as well?
No.
They have some conditionality.
Yes, okay, but the right kinds of conditionality and the right.
No, from them, the Chinese, what they're
absolutely.
offering, right?
Oh no, they're offering piles of cash, no questions asked. We'll give you a road. We don't care that much about corruption, but we want those that cobalt, or we want access to those oil fields. And we're going to have to offer another viable choice to those countries if we're going to be in the game.
Okay, I'm going to call on the woman here and the gentleman there. If you guys both promise to ask very brief questions, keep it brief. And then I'm going to ask the panelists to keep it brief, and that way we'll have honored everyone's inquietudes that I've seen, okay? So.
Zareen Caldwell from Global Dreams Consulting. The question I had is on Tide Aid. A number of years ago, I was living and working in Britain, and I vaguely recall that they have legislation that says there's only a certain amount of money that can go to domestic contractors, and by the way, we're going to try to source more of the supplies locally. I've never seen that kind of movement in the States.
Yes.
I was at a USAID function a few weeks ago. The woman was saying, what kind of difference would it have made in Iraq? Yes. They have more engineers there than anyone else in the world. Why weren't we giving those contracts to them versus the Americans flying in for $120,000 a year? Yes. We don't have that legislation here, and I'd like someone to comment on that.
Can I say one word on that?
Yeah, we will get everyone a chance to do that. My friend Tom, and then the gentleman in the back. So if you could first, ma'am, with the microphone, if you first get my friend Tom up here, and then we'll get the gentleman in the back.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Thomas Johnson. I work for USAID in the newish now Bureau for Policy Planning and Learning. I've been associated over the past 2 years with the types of things that this coalition was developed in response to. And while I think it's a great development, I frankly think many of your concerns are exaggerated. Many of these reforms are following things that Paul and others have been talking about for years. Paris, Accra, now Bassan. And in many respects, they're aspirational. Okay, we are not going to reach some of these targets for local capacity development as much as we would like to. We're not irresponsible, but we've got to make a movement in this direction. I happen to have been assisting the mission in Bangladesh with the project that Betsy was talking about in their follow-on design. They have been working with this coalition of NGOs now for decades with never a direct relationship. Okay? In the old days, we used to do that all the time. We would give assistance directly to local NGOs. It's not rocket science. And yet, because of staffing constraints and other things, we haven't done it in recent years. But it's not something that is all that new. And the implementation of procurement reform is mostly about the relationships. Okay? It's not about the procurement mechanisms per se. And just to set the record straight, we are not thinking about budget support. We're thinking about reimbursing costs, fixed amount reimbursement, and multi-donor trust funds and other types of program sector support. So it's not something that is, I think, going to have a CNN moment anytime soon. And to your question, just last week in the Federal Register, it was announced that we no longer, well, there were some changes that are kind of complicated. We can now do virtually all of our procurement locally. Okay, that comes under USAID Forward. That's one of the big things.
Okay, and the gentleman in the back, and if he promises to keep it brief, and then we'll let our panel. Madam, can you give it the? Yep. Okay. Yep.
Hello. Yeah, my name is Femi. I'm an intern at SID-Washington. A couple of quick comments. Talking about I think Mr. O'Brien actually hit the nail right on the head in terms of the problems with developing countries, especially in Africa. The problem is power. My economics teacher used to say that it's the rules of the game, right? That you have invested interest in those countries that do not want some of those projects to succeed, because if those projects and development happens, they're not going to have a job, they're not going to have a place they're going to get source of income from. So how does the development community actually address that problem of actually making sure that in the country, the people that have vested interest, they have an interest met at the same time there's development. The success with the thing with China that made China very successful is that they've been able to balance people vested in the government, in politics, their interest, and also match that with being able to develop, people and move them out of poverty. If you don't have that balance and making sure that people who are corrupt actually have their source of income stable and also getting people out of poverty, I don't think there's going to be any development. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Asif, could I ask you to respond first, please?
Thank you. How to get the right balance? I think there's a new phenomenon happening in the world, which many have been predicting for some time. And the simple fact is that unless we find the right balance between the power elites grabbing everything and the people getting nothing versus a better balance, what is happening is that countries are becoming ungovernable. And each country that goes that way creates an example for other people in other countries. And I think that's going to be a major force that we underestimate. Whether we can control where that goes, because just because countries become ungovernable, cease to be governed by the same people, become governed by different people, doesn't mean that it's going to lead to a better state. But it does mean that we're on a trajectory which is going to be very, very hard for countries to maintain. I wish I could say that with great optimism, but it is perhaps just a flicker of optimism in that path.
Betsy.
Well, the only thing I would respond to, just to say that I don't think that we're reacting to, our formation isn't because of concerns specifically, in any one area, just in general, to be able to bring, the good thinking forward in an experience that we have. And I think, the biggest issue really is timelines. And there's a political, driver to creating a faster timeline than is possible if you want to end up with success. And that's what we all really, really want. We want to make USAID, the U.S. government, look good. We want to achieve the best outcome for developing countries. And we have to recognize that if the direct relationship is the new goal, there's a timeline associated with making that happen, because you are actually introducing a whole new set of skills and requirements for local organizations, government, non-governmental, private sector, to be able to engage in that, something that we've all spent a lifetime of figuring out really how to do, and need to give it the time and not be the impatient American that think that these things can happen quickly when in fact they're a process, they require time for us to realize a joint success.
Okay, Paul, you get the last word.
Okay, a couple of quick comments. On the power front, I would add that to my R&D agenda if I was the president of a for-profit consulting firm. And I think a lot about information and how it's being transferred and how to use it more effectively. I think there's going to be really interesting new ideas there in the coming years. I'm glad Thomas is here and said what he said. I think we need to get our heads around the numbers on this. I may have it switched, but either with local procurement and with giving money to governments, one has gone to 6% of the aid budget, the other's gone to 4%. That's the kind of scale we're talking about. It's 30% total. 30% overall. Okay, so the vast majority still. So thanks for the correction on the numbers. Yeah. On Tide Aid, I think the first public advocacy mission of CIDC is to support the untying of aid. Let the best companies win, whether they're American or not American. If you guys are as good as I think you are, you will embrace the untying of aid. And I'll tell you what, it'll surprise the hell out of Washington.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you, everybody, for being here today. And thanks, I think it speaks to the fact that everyone stayed, that this is a very timely topic. So thank you, everybody, for being here. And let's thank our panelists.